In this video, we're going to be looking at the cerebrospinal fluid. This is chapter 14, part 3. Cerebrospinal fluid, or abbreviated CSF, this is a clear and colorless liquid. It's composed primarily of water, and it protects the brain and spinal cord from chemical and also physical injuries. It carries very small amounts of oxygen, glucose, and other chemicals that are needed to the neurons and neuroglia from the blood. CSF will continually circulate through cavities in the brain and the spinal cord and around the brain and the spinal cord in the subarachnoid space. In this picture here, you can see the 4 cerebrospinal fluid filled cavities within the brain, and these are called ventricles. So we have these ventricles here. We have one lateral ventricle in each hemisphere of the cerebrum. So these are going to be ventricles 1 and 2. So here we have one lateral ventricle, and then the other one behind it there on the other side or in the other hemisphere. And then we have the 3rd ventricle right here. And this is a very narrow, kind of a slit-like cavity, and this is along the midline superior to the hypothalamus, and it's between the right and left halves of the thalamus. So right here in the middle there. And then we also have the 4th ventricle, which is down here, and this lies between the brainstem and the cerebrum. Anteriorly, the lateral ventricles are separated by this thin membrane called the septum pellucidum. There's going to be this thin membrane right here separating the lateral ventricles. Now, the cerebrospinal fluid also has 3 basic functions that I want to talk about. First off is basic physical mechanical protection. So really, the cerebrospinal fluid serves as a shock absorber to protect the brain and spinal cord, which are really delicate tissues, from jolts or sudden movements that, if the cerebrospinal fluid wasn't there, the brain and spinal cord would hit against the bony walls of the cranial cavity and the vertebral canal. Secondly, the cerebrospinal fluid acts a lot in homeostasis. So the pH of the cerebrospinal fluid really affects pulmonary ventilation or breathing through the lungs, and also cerebral blood flow. And this is really important in maintaining the homeostatic controls for the brain tissue. Thirdly, it helps a lot in circulation. So the cerebrospinal fluid acts as a medium for minor exchange of nutrients and waste products between the blood and the nervous tissue surrounding it. Cerebrospinal fluid formed in the choroid plexuses of each lateral ventricle flows into the 3rd ventricle through 2 narrow oval openings called the interventricular foramina. Foramina would be plural. So here we have this little opening here, the interventricular foramen. And then more cerebrospinal fluid is added by the choroid plexus in the roof of the 3rd ventricle, right here. So you can also see that on this diagram here. We have cerebrospinal fluid formed by the choroid plexuses in the lateral ventricles through the interventricular foramina, and then the choroid plexus of the 3rd ventricle is added to that. The fluid then flows through the aqueduct of the midbrain, labeled right here, also called the cerebral aqueduct. found right here. And this passes through the midbrain into the fourth ventricle. This was right here. And then the choroid plexus of the fourth ventricle contributes a little more cerebrospinal fluid. And again, it's going to be labeled here in this little diagram. The cerebrospinal fluid will then enter the subarachnoid space through 3 openings in the roof of the fourth ventricle. So we have a single median aperture and paired lateral apertures. So those are going to be right in here. These lateral apertures are going to be one on either side. The cerebrospinal fluid will then circulate in the central canal of the spinal cord and in the subarachnoid space around the surfaces of the brain and the spinal cord. So you can see these arrows kind of going here in the subarachnoid space here, and then also down there into the subarachnoid space around the spinal cord and in the central canal as well. And you can see up here too, the subarachnoid space all around the brain as well. So here you can see these little purple arrows of the cerebrospinal fluid circulating in that subarachnoid space around the brain. And the cerebrospinal fluid is then gradually reabsorbed back into the blood through arachnoid villi. So these little spots here, you can see. And these are like finger-like projections or extensions of the arachnoid matter that project into the dural venous sinuses, especially the superior sagittal sinus, which is this blue space that you see around the brain here, with these blue arrows around this major blue space, which is the superior sagittal sinus. So that's how cerebrospinal fluid circulates, and that's how it's going to be reabsorbed back into the bloodstream. So you can also see that here on this left diagram, into the subarachnoid space, and then into the arachnoid villi, back into the venous blood to the heart and lungs, and then circulated back through. Now, normally cerebrospinal fluid is reabsorbed as rapidly as it's formed by the choroid plexuses. And because the rates of formation are the same as the rates of reabsorption, the pressure and the volume of cerebrospinal fluid usually remains pretty constant. You can also have this, this key down here, which shows the color of the arrows, purple being the cerebrospinal fluid flow, and blue being the venous blood. And that's going to be the end of Chapter 14, Part 3.